Thank you very much to ERA for inviting me to speak. I'm very honored to be able to present my research here, which I hope can contribute to the extensive expertise that is here in the room. So, as Minos already mentioned, I will be talking about, we'll shift now a little bit the focus to more of the external dimension of EU migration and asylum policy. So I will look a little bit at what are its features, what are the most important practical examples that have been put in place over the last years. And then I'll try to do an evaluation and highlight certain challenges that arise according to my opinion in those policies. Just a little back message is that I do have a legal background, but I work in policy research, so you will see that the presentation will cover a bit both and switch a bit from one to the other. This is also due to the fact that I think it's very limiting to just look at the policies without taking into consideration the legal consequences and the other way around. Okay, so an EU external policy, well, migration generally, but even more specifically the external dimension of it, has always been jealously kept by member states and their exclusive competence. There had been already some agreements with third countries in the 1990s, but a better communitarization of EU migration policies at the external level have been done through the Lisbon Treaty particularly, and the creation of an overarching framework of external policy, which is the global approach to migration and mobility, which was initially done in 2005 and then extended to include the mobility aspect in 2012. Until 2015, there was not a very developed it was not a very developed aspect of EU policy. It was not extremely discussed in day-to-day meetings. And well, then 2015 happened. We heard a lot about the EU conceiving this as a crisis. There has been clearly a massive inflow, as we can see from these graphs, particularly from the Eastern Mediterranean part. The Central Mediterranean route had been quite stable on these numbers over the years that preceded it. So what is this due to? Here we can see also very much how the EU frames the flows that is coming to it. So the causes very, very briefly, I mean, obviously there is the increased insecurity in the neighborhood, conflicts that had been starting in 2011, but then obviously a higher influx in the years following of people moving out of the surrounding countries that they had been first seeking protection. The EU policy framework was not prepared to deal with this inflow. Particularly, this was also due to the fact that the nature of the flows has been immensely changing, and that now we're dealing with mixed flows, and that this brings a great challenge for the administration, because there are many people that are do not have the possibility to seek economic possibilities through legal channels, and therefore basically use the asylum system in order to gain residency permits in the countries. And this obviously creates two big problems. On the one hand, there is a big overburden of the asylum system, and on the other hand, there is also a sense of creation of abuse of the system, which then results in loss of public support. And to this point, it is very important to point out that this crisis situation, as described by the EU, is not only the result of external changes, but is also determined by the EU's policies. And particular, I'm referring to the visa policy and to the carrier sanctions directive. And these are just certain parts of a framework that does create a situation where it is not possible to enter the territory, if not in very exceptional cases, such as resettlement. But we know UNHCR says only 1% of those that are already been recognized as particularly vulnerable are only able to be resettled. Family reunion, we have seen a very restrictive trend in many European countries over the last years, and high-skilled workers through the Blue Card Directive, but that's also very, very limited and does also not very much respond to the market demands also from our side. So this results basically in both people in search of protection and people in search of economic opportunities not having many possibilities of legal entry. And this obviously then contributes again to the mixed migratory flows and mixed paths. So as we were seeing those big inflows, this crisis situation as described by the EU, certainly this has brought to a reinforced approach. It was nicely said before, a panic phase. I think this we can apply also to the external dimension, because there has been an increased effort to stop the flows before they reach the EU's shores. And this is a policy that has been generally described as externalisation in the EU, saying that the goals are on the one hand to prevent the deaths and on the other hand to simply curb the flows. And this, in terms of EU policies, has brought to the adoption of overarching framework, both financially speaking and in terms of political dialogues, and in the creation of emergency or satellite funding mechanisms. We will discuss later what exactly has been done, and also what impact those kind of policies have on the one hand on the political relations with those third countries in the long term also, and on the other hand on what impact this has on the rights of those that are directly concerned. But just to give a brief overview over what has been done over the last years. So following the peak in flows and therefore an increased discussion at the supranational level in 2015, in 2016, the famous EUTurkey Deal was adopted, and as a consequence, there was a strong decrease in flows on the Eastern Mediterranean route. And this obviously brought countries like Italy to push to basically adopt the same approach on their shores. Italy, in April 2016, the Prime Minister Renzi proposed the Italian Migration Compact, which is basically a document addressed to the Commission in which they called for reinforced cooperation with third countries and basically to export elsewhere the EU-Turkey deal to other areas where there is less resources and political capital that had been invested in the relations. Shortly after, in July, the EU adopted the new partnership framework, and which is a framework for EU and member states cooperation with third countries, and has devolved an increased attention to the EU Trust Fund for Africa, which was already existing but was a bit an empty shell. 2017, well, Italy did not see this decrease in flows. It had actually even an increase in flows in 2016. Libya became more and more central, being really the main departure country for all sub-Saharan migration to Italy. And consequently, as Italy was waiting for some European action, but nothing was really happening in concrete terms, it decided to step forwards on its own and basically conclude a bilateral agreement with Libya. So on the 2nd of February 2017, the Gentiloni-Serraj Memorandum of Understanding was signed. And, but this is just really the stepping stone of a whole policy approach that Italy has been bringing forward on the other side of the Mediterranean, with really bilateral dialogues with other countries such as Tunisia and very strongly Niger, to talking with many, many different actors in Libya, to local municipalities, and we don't know who else, unfortunately. And also an increase in multilateral dialogues and meetings. So there is the Central Mediterranean Contact Group, there was the Paris Summit. So there is really, this has been brought increasingly to the EU, or let's say European level. But before looking into the specific cases, what is generally meant with externalization of migration control? So you refer generally to formal or informal agreements that are concluded by the EU or by its member states with third countries, and which generally regard the funding and the training of local border guards or of instruments to enhance the third country's migration control capacities. These agreements can sometimes even lead to joint police operations, and also what is often linked to externalization are the readmission agreements. This approach has often been criticized as outsourcing the migration management to a third country and to basically creating a buffer zone which stops off the flows before they reach the public opinion and the court's reach. This is one of the criticisms of this approach. But apart from concluding those agreements with third countries, what has the EU done in the last years over the in terms of its external policy is that it has been advocating for an increasing interdependence of foreign policy objectives. So it has, in the name of a global approach, it has been increasingly linking trade, development, migration, security aspects all together. And this has often been criticized as resulting in conditionality, so linking development support to conditioning it to obtaining results in migration management. And on the other hand, obviously, there has been a strong focus more on the security aspects, and this is there is a very easy reason for this, and that's that in infra-EU, it's the topic where it's easier to obtain consensus by all the member states. So there has been more focus on the reinforcement of external borders than on the protection aspects. And this is also very linked, obviously, to the whole rhetoric. So you can really see in certain documents, I feel in the Italian ones even more, but even in the European ones, there is quite a shift in also the terminology that is being used, which is quite interesting. Looking at externalization in practice. So, well, firstly, the EU-Turkey deal, and as Minos already mentioned, I mean, this is really something that has been discussed all over. So I will not focus excessively on this because I think it's a topic that everyone is quite aware. I'll just shortly say that I think in terms of innovative aspects that the EU-Turkey deal was carrying is that it was for the first time really an EU deal or agreement or dialogue, call it as you want, but it was the EU 28 member states agreeing on stepping forward and dialoguing with a third country. So this is already quite an achievement, and it has also not really been repeated afterwards. Another very important aspect was the resettlement component, which was the first time that a resettlement component was actually brought into the discussion when dealing with third countries and linked to a migration management aspect. And third, the fact that the funds were channeled through a specific program through the EU Refugee Facility for Turkey, and therefore linked to specific objectives of better integration in the country. So it was not a simple budget support to the government, but it is linked to certain objectives. The EU-Turkey deal has been criticized for a whole range of aspects, especially under the human rights point of view, but also as far as the conditionality approach is concerned. Indeed, the resettlement, the disbursement of further economic support has all been very strictly linked in the deal to the reduction of inflows and to the readmission that was also incorporated in the deal. And this, even in broader political terms, what was very problematic is that the whole accession process of Turkey was very much linked to this migration management aspect, which obviously also only represents a very small aspect of a whole range of foreign policy aspects. So the difficult question, was it a success or a failure? I think there is no real answer to that. Certainly there has been a reduction of entries, so for the EU that is certainly an aspect that speaks for it being a success. It's one of the little areas where EU-Turkey cooperation is still somehow holding. There are menaces by Turkey sometimes to stop implementing the deal, but most experts say it's not very probable that this will happen, as both sides actually benefit quite greatly from the deal. On the other hand, there has been no visa liberalization, there have been no steps forward in the accession process, so the whole broader political conditions that were actually incorporated in the deal did not really do a step forward, and actually there has been a deterioration of EU-Turkey relations. But coming to more recent, the new partnership framework, as I was mentioning before, is really provides, the idea is that it develops the European agenda on migration's external dimension, and that it has the aim of enhancing cooperation with countries of origin, transit and destination, so also among member states with third states, the EU with the member states and third states. So it really wants to provide a framework for all kind of cooperation, and in that sense also profit from the member states' own initiatives at the EU level. And the instruments through which this should happen is tailor-made partnerships, so those famous mini compacts, with third countries, and which have the nature of a political framework and which can include technical or legal agreements. And they're all tailor-made in the sense that they have to be discussed with one country after the other, looking at the specific conditions on the ground and what also are the requests by the counterpart. So the main elements, as I said, that it represents an overarching framework. In the rhetoric, it had actually quite a multifocal approach, speaking of horizontal cooperation, looking at the interests of the partner countries. But what very much emerges from the new partnership framework language is the conditionality approach. It really expressly refers to positive and negative incentives in development and trade policy linked to curbing migration. It speaks of all EU policies should in principle be part of a package bringing maximum leverage to the discussion. And what has been said is that this global approach carries the risk of cementing a shift towards a policy that then the whole foreign policy being centered about the one main objective at this point, which is the reduction of migratory flows from the partner countries. What is quite interesting to see is also the whole funding aspect, because as migration has, and the external dimension has been gaining increasing centrality in the EU discourse, there has been a rise in total funds of 11.3% according to the European Council in 2017 compared to 2016. But this has also brought to a proliferation of instruments and of new kind of instruments, such as, for example, the EU Trust Fund for Africa, which is basically a container for already it basically regroups pre-existing EU and member states contribution. Member states' contribution at the moment are only at 6%, so 94% is actually taken from pre-existing EU budget, such as from the European Development Fund, I think, for the biggest part. And what is an issue that is carried by this proliferation of instruments is that there is a lack of transparency as of how much from which fund is going to finance which project. There is actually quite a nice website by the EU Trust Fund for Africa, which details where the money comes from, but then it is very difficult to understand if there is not money being allocated twice. This is also, for example, the case with Italy, who created a fund for Africa, a specific one, but then half of the fund for Africa actually goes into the European Trust Fund for Africa. So it's very difficult to avoid counting double and understanding really where the money is going And this is also something that has been very much criticized by the European Parliament and by the Court of Auditors, who have actually criticized those ad hoc instruments or satellite budget mechanisms, as they have called them, as they nullify the European Parliament's control function and also pose a risk to the unity of the budget. Next to this is the other aspect, which links a bit back to the conditionality, which is the migration development nexus. So there has been more and more this discourse of investing in development in order to resolve migration in countries of origin. But first of all, there is extensive research by economic experts that demonstrates that actually the first effect of development support is actually probably to curb to increase migration, and also this has very often resulted in a redirection of development funds for migration control objectives, which can be seen as being in contrast to the EU consensus for humanitarian aid guidelines, which say that humanitarian objectives have to be kept separate from all political, military, economic, and other objectives. The latest thing is what you can see is a very nice picture from the report by Concord. It just came out, I think, last week. It's the Aid Watch report 2017. And it actually looks exactly at a very crucial point, which is that also if the total international development has been rising in the last years, much of this is also due to intra-European refugee costs being accounted under ODA. So for example, in the case of Italy, according to Concord, 34% of its official development aid is actually for intra-EU costs, intra-Italian refugee costs, obviously in that case. So last thing to the funding is that as you may have heard over the last days, the European Trust Fund is running out of money. So it is in need of new contributions, as I mentioned, mostly member states' contributions, as they have been so far very little, only 6% of the total amount. And of this 6%, 50% is from Italy, who has invested 102 million. Second country is Germany with 51 million, and other major European countries such as France and Spain are only at 3 million. So there is also quite some difference in the commitments to the European Trust Fund for Africa. Coming to Italy's external migration policy, which is my main topic of research over the last years. 2017 has been the year of Italian external migration policy. I will try to give you a short overview, and I'm obviously happy to tackle any details in the discussion afterwards. So Italy is really taking the lead in 2017, both in political terms, pushing at EU level for European answers, but also bilaterally intervening with many actors on the ground, particularly, as I was mentioning, Libya and Niger. And also in terms of funding, I was mentioning before that Italy has actually created this Italian Fund for Africa, which is of 200 million, of which 100 million went into the European Trust Fund for Africa, and others are used for bilateral agreements. So also in terms of funding, it has quite stepped up. And the memorandum of understanding that I mentioned before with Libya is really, it has been sold as the first chapter in a new era of cooperation between Italy and Libya on migration control. And to this, I just maybe have to say that in the 2000s, Italy had a very strong cooperation with Libya on migration control. This broke down in 2011, 2012, both due to the outbreak of the civil war in Libya and to the ECTHR condemnation of Italy, Hirsi Jamaa. So more precisely, I mean, it's a document which is 3 pages long. It adopts quite generic language. It does not point out specific funds. It does not point out specific projects as most of those agreements. But it talks about strengthening the southern land border in Libya, financing and supplying tools and medicines for the local reception centers, training Libyan personnel, and supporting international organizations, and by that probably IOM and UNHCR in Libya, which are in those days actually getting back on the ground. The problem is that, as always, it mentions two main objectives. On the one hand, investing in development support, in the other hand, curbing migratory flows. But if you then look at the specific actions that are outlined in the memorandum, it really concentrates on the latter aspect. And indeed, in the last months, we have seen a strong decrease in flows from Libya to Italy. So, and this is due, apparently, obviously there is never complete assurance to data, but there has been a prevention of departures on the ground. There have been interceptions at sea, taking people back to the local detention centers because they're not reception centers. And there has also been apparently a reduction in the crossings between Niger and Libya. If it is a bad replication of the EU-Turkey deal, well, it follows the lines of the EU-Turkey deal to a certain extent, but it has several key aspects that the EU-Turkey deal had, positive aspects that are actually missing. First of all, there is no resettlement component, but even worse, there is no recognition at all in the whole document of the possibility that there are people in need of international protection on the ground, and that might be affected by those policies. The term refugee, legal migration, never mentioned. There is even the talk, it doesn't even say irregular migration, it talks explicitly the whole time about illegal or clandestine migrants. So this is also important to see the language that, that is being adopted. There is a complete lack of reference to the international protection and human rights framework. So this is quite worrying. On the other hand, there is not much clarity to the origin and to the destination of funds. As far as the origin is concerned, it's mostly the EU Trust Fund for Africa and the Italian Fund for Africa, but there is no official documentation about who gets the money, who are the actors that Italy is actually talking with on the ground. The Associated Press had reported, not only the Associated Press, but there have been several reports of the Italian money going directly to militias and previous smugglers that now lock people in the detention centers. The Italian Foreign Affairs Ministry obviously absolutely denied this and said that the Italian money is only going to the governmental, to Al-Siraj, who then deals with the situation on the ground. Third aspect that is obviously very different to Turkey is the political and the human rights situation on the ground in Libya, particularly concerning the legal point of view. Libya is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. There is no national framework regarding asylum or migrants' rights. Migrants are detained upon arrival, so that's obviously also a very, very different situation, which is quite worrying. And but as I was mentioning before, there has been the recognition that actually all the flows that in the end transit through Libya to Italy also transit through Niger before that. And indeed, numbers are about, in the Italian ministries, they told me 75–80% of those who transit through Niger in the end come to Italy. So it has been identified as really the main transit country, both at the European level and for Italy. Italy has been deploying there are some troops on the ground. It's not exactly clear how many. There is lots of funding going there. 48% of the Italian Fund for Africa has been used for Niger. 50 million for a budget support project to the Nigerian government in order to improve its border control capacities. Another 15 million to a joint IOM project that basically has the objective of increasing voluntary returns. So this is the situation as it is at the moment. As I mentioned, if you want to deepen certain aspects, I will be happy to do so. But coming to more of an evaluation, the EU's perspective is the following. I hope that you can hear but I think they don't. Oh no. Ah, that's terrible. It doesn't show the video. Okay, well, it is a video. It's not very long. It's a video from the European Council. You can look it up on the internet. It is a video that tells you that there has been great success in curbing illegal migration. Also, in this case, the word choice is important. It tells you that the deal with Turkey has worked out perfectly. It tells you that the Libyan Coast Guard is getting trained and is bringing people back to reception centers. No, the European Council refers to holding centers. They're a little bit more sincere in that. I mean, we can definitely see this is the data from the Italian Interior Ministry. You can see that the drop starting in July, but particularly August, has really been striking. There has been a slight increase again in September. October, it's not complete numbers of the 23rd of October. There is a little bit of worry at the Italian level because they are seeing that not all of the actors are really cooperating. So they don't feel that they have completely solved the situation, but as you can see, I mean, it's really quite striking. But obviously this situation creates a range of political and legal challenges that I would like to quickly point out. I'll go a bit quicker through the political dimension, being mostly lawyers here. But I think it's important to say that this is very much it seems to be a short-term approach where the focus is very much on migration management. There is no real understanding of the partners' priorities, but particularly of the complexity and of the reality of the flows. If you talk to people on the ground in Niger, they are completely surprised by those measures that are being taken. 86% of migration inside of the Sahel is circular migration, which is intra-regional, which is for economic reasons, because people have seasonal work possibilities in different places. And this is not at all being taken into consideration because after Agadez, which is still even in ECOWAS territory, so this is another legal challenge on what legal grounds are people being stopped after Agadez if they're have not reached yet the Libyan border and they're still in ECOWAS territory. But so there is really a lack of understanding between the parties on what are the priorities. This can have the risk of getting very problematic in the long term. Already around Agadez, there is a lot of protest. The transit of migrants was a fundamental economic income. Lots of people are now without their income, and they're obviously not happy about this. So there is protest at the local level. So these are all factors that one has to keep in mind, especially if you look at the history of Niger, which is a country that is now quite stable since some years, but has really a background of coup d'etat and really so big issues. So this cannot simply be looked over. Also, the EU has to remember that it is not the sole player in the region. China is starting to invest heavily, economically speaking, but also in security terms in Africa. So the EU can also lose its leverage in terms of always linking, because China, for example, is not an actor that does condition its economic support to, for example, migration flows. They are only worried about the security and the terrorism aspect in that sense. So this is a bit the more long-term worries. Then obviously there is the internal dimension that if the EU is lacking a common voice and continues in having an emergency response approach, this damages obviously also its external action. Coming to legal dimensions. So as I previously pointed out, the framework that is currently existing in the EU tends to create this migration asylum nexus, which means that asylum seekers have to undergo the same general immigration conditions as everyone else in order to enter the country. They are not recognized any special status before they don't set foot in the country. And this can be found or is increasingly being voiced as violating the international protection framework. Firstly, it has been said that refugee status is a declaratory right of declaratory nature, and that therefore it has to be granted. And as well that Article 6 of the Refugee Convention, it refers to not putting asylum seekers under bureaucratic requirements that they're not able to meet. So this creates an issue and can fuel some discussion in the sense that if today it is certain that there is a violation to non-refoulement, if there is the disembarkment to a country where the life is at risk, as well as concerning chain refoulement, the question is if the impeding access to territory, meaning that there is also no access to protection, if this can also be found to be in violation. And this consequently obviously fools the whole discussion if there is a positive duty for states. Another very important aspect that is emerging, especially concerning the case with Libya, is when the state is not proceeding to direct actions itself, but if the migration management is outsourced to a third country, basically shifting the responsibility. And it is now being very much discussed. For example, in Italy, there is several NGOs that are planning to bring the Italian government to court on this. And so the idea is that that Italy can be found complicit for the violations of international law committed by Libya. This can be found under Article 16 of the ILC draft articles on responsibility of states. If the state does so with knowledge of the circumstances of the internationally wrongful act, and if the act would be internationally wrongful if committed by that state. In the case of Italy-Libya, Italy is funding, training the Libyan Coast Guard, and in certain situations, even more precisely, it is giving the indications. It is the Italian Maritime Center that coordinates the operations. So there have been cases in which the Italian Maritime Center tells the Libyan Coast Guard where a boat is in distress. So there is clearly even a strong link. So knowledge and consensus on Italy's side, definitely yes. The agreement with Libya explicitly identifies the voluntary and forcible returns as a fundamental objective of the cooperation, and also that those acts result in breaches of international law. I think that on that there is no discussion. So, but that's somehow only half of the story, because we're only talking about migration policies at this point. And so what about asylum policies? So the whole external dimension discourse at the EU level has been focused very much on the migration aspect, whilst the asylum dimension has not been very much taken into consideration. The EU has always mentioned the creation of legal pathways since years, but there's not much going on except for some resettlement. And for example, Italy has a humanitarian corridor program, as well as some other member states, but we're talking about really small numbers there. But if there is the outsourcement of migration management in the case of dealing with mixed migratory flows, this means that necessarily this implies also the outsourcing of asylum management to a certain degree. And so this creates a very, very difficult legal situation. And the topic that has been discussed in that sense since years, actually, and now is being brought on the table again, is the question of extraterritorial processing. Very recently, Macron mentioned protection missions. It has been called in all different kind of ways. With his protection missions, at the beginning, he seemed to point towards extraterritorial processing. But then, if you look at the attachment of the Paris summit decision, it actually refers back to the resettlement and therefore to the proposal by the Commission to resettle those 4,000, as was mentioned also this morning. So the idea at the moment seems to be a transit center in Niger, to which also there can be some humanitarian evacuation programs from Libya, from where then to resettle those people to the member states that have pledged a certain amount. This carries a whole lot of practical issues, starting from the fact that talking with some officials, they were telling how this would become a primary objective of international terrorism, so it would need to be a military facility. So it is, when you go down to the practical terms, it gets highly complicated. And what makes the whole issue of extraterritorial processing even more complicated is how do you do it if you don't have an European common asylum system, the same system to evaluate the claims. So either it is the single member states that do it themselves, for example, through embassy asylum, which has happened in the past, or no country will want to be the first one who will be doing it by itself. So this is really a topic that is going to be discussed increasingly over the next months and probably years. Just concluding, as one should never criticize without proposing something also for the future. You can probably already grasp that from the rest of the presentation. In order for the EU to maintain a political credibility and to enable long-term cooperation, not only the investment in the stability, but particularly in understanding the neighborhood. There often seems to be a lack of understanding or of willingness to understand that the local realities are very different from what we think. Internally, obviously, without finding a common position and without creating public consensus on these issues, it is very difficult. These are obviously also long-term goals, so what can be done in the short term? Well, something that could be done is that when concluding those kind of agreements, that there should be a sort of positive conditionality, meaning that the disbursement of further economic support could also be linked to the improvement of human rights conditions, and not only to the reduction of flows. And as far as the protection-sensitive entry system is concerned, well, breaking the asylum migration nexus very much links back again to the need of creating alternatives, both for asylum seekers and workers. So this is obviously two separate things. Yeah, I think I'll cut off here so we have some time for the discussion.